Before we get to the moment Senator Ted Cruz realized that interrupting someone who holds proof of your wrongdoing only speeds up your own downfall, make sure you hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. What you're about to see reveals how frantic interruptions often become unintentional admissions of guilt when the other person is fully prepared and ready to expose the truth. The Senate Judiciary Committee's hearing on judicial ethics reform had essentially become Ted Cruz's personal stage for nearly 2 straight hours. The Harvard-educated senator was performing his usual blend of forced intellectual superiority, dramatic outrage, and highly practiced soundbites tailor-made for conservative media outlets all morning. He had been especially combative, using his past experience as a prosecutor to corner witnesses, leaning on his debate team confidence to twist statements, and carefully timing his reactions so the cameras would catch every moment exactly the way he wanted. When Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett began her testimony on how dark money influences federal judicial nominations, Cruz had already cut her off 3 separate times. Each interruption came wrapped in technical objections clearly designed to throw her off balance and assert his control over the room. Crockett was laying out documented evidence showing how powerful donors were effectively buying influence over federal judgeships using targeted contributions. She had been moving through her evidence step by step when Cruz launched his 4th interruption. But this one was different. Gone was the polished performance he normally displayed. Instead, there was a sharp, unsteady edge in his voice, a tone that made everyone in the chamber look up. He didn't wait for a natural break in her testimony. He didn't pretend to raise a procedural concern. He simply bulldozed over her words, speaking louder and louder as if the volume alone could bury the facts she was presenting. "Congresswoman Crockett," Cruz shouted, half rising from his chair in a way that clearly broke Senate decorum, "you're engaging in McCarthy-like tactics, throwing around accusations without proof, dragging respectable people through the mud with baseless conspiracy theories. This kind of reckless behavior tears down our institutions. You sit there with your scripted remarks and that folder of so-called evidence, but all you're really doing is poisoning the confirmation process with attention-grabbing claims instead of facts." He didn't stop. His words came faster and messier, each sentence stepping on the next. "For 2 hours I've listened to this character attack disguised as oversight, and I'm not going to let it continue. You want to talk about dark money? Fine, let's talk about the dark money pouring into your own campaigns. Let's talk about the special interests funding you. Let's talk about the radical groups backing your political rise groups that want to tear apart the American judicial system." The room exploded into disorder. The chairman slammed his gavel, demanding Cruz follow the rules. Other senators shouted for him to stop. People in the gallery whispered as they tried to process the level of open panic unfolding before them. Cruz kept barreling ahead, his face reddening, sweat forming at his hairline, his arms moving wildly as he tried to drown out Crockett with sheer noise, but Crockett didn't flinch. She stayed completely still, watching Cruz with the calm focus of someone who knew this moment was coming and had been waiting for it. When Cruz finally ran out of breath, the room fell into silence. The entire chamber turned to Crockett. She reached into her folder, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and held it delicately between her fingers. She looked directly at Cruz with a steady, controlled expression, the kind of look someone gives right before revealing the one fact that ends the entire argument. "Senator Cruz," Crockett said, her voice unwavering and painfully calm, making the earlier chaos feel even more dramatic. "Since you've interrupted me 4 times, let me respond to all your concerns with just one simple document." She lifted the paper so the cameras, senators, and spectators could see it clearly. "This is a wire transfer receipt for $16 million, she said, "sent from Harlan Crow to your Cayman Islands account. The date is 3 days before you push through the confirmation of Judge Matthews, whose very first ruling delivered Crow's companies a $200 million financial benefit. You want to discuss dark money, Senator? Fine, Crockett said steadily. Let's talk about the $73 million. you've collected from ultra-wealthy donors in exchange for pushing their preferred judges onto the federal bench. Let's talk about the emails where you offer specific judicial outcomes in return for massive contributions. And let's talk about the audio clip where you clearly say, and I'm quoting your own words here, "I don't care if they're qualified. If the check clears, they get the robe." The silence that followed felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Cruz's face shifted from furious red to a ghostly pale, so quickly that several people later admitted they thought he might collapse. His mouth moved as if he were trying to speak, but no sound came out. The single sheet of paper in Crockett's hand might, as well have been a live grenade for how completely it wiped out his attempted grandstanding. Senators on both sides sat frozen, stunned into absolute stillness as they processed what had just been revealed. You could hear the hum of the air, conditioning as clearly as footsteps. But Crockett wasn't finished, not even close. She reached calmly into her folder again and lifted another document with the same quiet precision. "Your fifth interruption was going to accuse me of radical affiliations." "Let's skip that," she said. "Instead, here's your correspondence with Russian oligarch Oleg Volkov. In these messages, you promised to advance judges who would rule in favor of Russian-linked business interests inside the United States. In return, $28 million was funneled through layered shell companies to your political committees. Senator Cruz, you weren't only selling judicial power, you were selling it to foreign powers." The bombshell information Crockett was laying out came from an 18-month investigation conducted under intense secrecy. It began when forensic financial analysts noticed unusual patterns in donations tied to Cruz. Money from seemingly unrelated entities appeared just before or right after key judicial confirmations patterns, too perfect to dismiss as random. When investigators followed the financial trails, they uncovered a corruption network so vast that even seasoned experts were stunned. Cruz had long sold himself as a fierce constitutional defender, a strict originalist devoted to the rule of law. His resume is elite: Princeton undergrad, Harvard Law, clerk to a Supreme Court justice, and Texas Solicitor General. He had used those credentials as armor both to project intellectual superiority and to shield himself from scrutiny. His dramatic Senate performances had earned him hero status among conservatives, who thought he was fighting to protect the judiciary from political influence. But investigators discovered that Cruz's entire brand was a carefully built illusion. Behind that polished image was one of the most elaborate judicial corruption operations in modern U.S. history. He had effectively turned federal judgeships into purchasable commodities, with himself acting as the broker collecting enormous payouts for delivering confirmations. The system he used was complicated: shell corporations, offshore accounts, intermediaries, and donation pipelines built to disguise the sources. But the trail was still unmistakable. One of the clearest patterns involved billionaire Harlan Crow. For years, Crow had quietly funneled money to Cruz through barely traceable channels. In return, Cruz helped install 17 federal judges, every one of whom later issued rulings that benefited Crow's companies. Statisticians later determined the odds of that happening by chance were essentially zero. As Cruz sat frozen in complete disbelief, Crockett continued dismantling his career piece by piece. She read through communications, exposed financial records, and laid out evidence one document at a time. Each page she raised added another layer to the emerging scandal. "Here is your message to the Federalist Society," she said calmly, holding up another printout. "In this email, you state plainly that judicial nominations are available at different price ranges for district courts, circuit courts, and even potential Supreme Court seats. You weren't protecting the courts, Senator. You were running an auction. You listed the prices yourself," Crockett continued, her tone controlled and unshakable. $3 million for a district court seat, $7 million for a circuit court appointment. And if another Supreme Court vacancy opens, you said you'd need at least $50 million. She signaled to the staff, and the screens around the committee lit up with bank records. Each deposit matched the exact timeline of judicial confirmations Cruz had aggressively pushed. Every judge you've supported for the last 6 years was paid for by someone who had active cases before their court. You've turned the federal bench into a marketplace, one where justice goes to the wealthiest bidder. Then came the most explosive moment yet. Crockett lifted another document, this one thick, printed on official transcript paper. Several senators gasped as soon as they recognized it. "This," she said, "is a transcript of a recorded call where you explain how to ensure these judges deliver the rulings their buyers want. You even discuss providing draft opinions written by the donors themselves." Cruz finally managed to speak, though his voice cracked painfully. This is a setup," he croaked. "These papers are fake. This is some deep state attempt to frame me because I've been effective. They're terrified of my work. This is political assassination." Without reacting to his excuse, Crockett held up yet another document, this one marked with unmistakable Department of Justice seals. "Fabricated? This is the cooperation agreement your former Chief of Staff, Marcus Davidson, signed with federal prosecutors. He has been wearing a wire for the FBI for 8 months. He recorded over 100 hours of conversations with you discussing prices, discussing delivery guarantees, discussing judges like they were items on a shelf. And, if you'd like, Senator, I can play some of those recordings for the committee right now." The word recordings blew the room apart. Senators were shouting over each other, some demanding a closed session, some calling for Cruz's immediate removal, some insisting the evidence be heard publicly. The gallery exploded with angry yelling and stunned disbelief. The chairman slammed his gavel so hard the microphone screeched, threatening to clear the room if order wasn't restored. Meanwhile, Cruz sat slumped in place, hollow-eyed and shaking. Whatever fight he had came in with was gone. He looked like a man watching his political life, his public identity, and his future vanish all at once, but Crockett wasn't finished, not yet. She reached into her folder one last time and pulled out a thick stack of documents marked with the highest classification clearance. These had been specially declassified for the hearing. The room went silent again. "Senator Cruz," she said, her voice firm but devastatingly calm, "your interruptions today weren't just rude, they were attempts to block evidence. You knew these documents existed. You knew you were the target of a federal criminal investigation that has been ongoing for 2 years. And you were fully aware that FBI agents were prepared to take you into custody as soon as this hearing ended. Your interruptions weren't procedural objections, they were obstruction of justice." She rose to her feet, addressing Cruz, the senators, and the entire country at once. "You have spent your entire career pretending to defend the Constitution while secretly auctioning the federal judiciary to wealthy buyers. You took money not just from billionaires but from foreign adversaries to manipulate American justice. You interrupted me 5 times to stop this evidence from entering the public record." She paused, letting the weight of her words land. "But the truth is simple. You can't interrupt anymore. Because you're not acting as a senator today. You're standing here as a defendant. And the $73 million you took to corrupt American justice, those weren't donations, Senator. That was blood money. And the responsibility for what you've done lies entirely on your hands." The moments that followed were like nothing the Senate had ever seen. Cruz tried to rise, maybe to speak, maybe to flee, but his legs gave out, and he fell back into his chair in a dazed collapse. The doors opened instantly. FBI agents who had been waiting just outside entered the chamber. Their presence alone confirmed that every word Crockett had said was true. Senators and spectators alike watched in stunned disbelief as federal agents approached Cruz's desk. The image of a sitting U.S. senator facing arrest during a live hearing became instantly iconic, one of the most unforgettable scenes in American history. The arrest itself was calm, procedural, almost routine, but the context made it feel earth-shaking. The agents calmly recited Cruz's Miranda rights as the entire Senate Judiciary Committee watched in absolute shock. Cruz didn't fight back, didn't argue, and didn't even seem fully aware of what was happening as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. While being escorted out of the chamber, he turned to look at Crockett one final time. His expression wasn't anger or defiance, it looked almost like relief. As if the pressure of maintaining a false life had suddenly disappeared, within just a few hours, the FBI executed search warrants at Cruz's homes in both Texas and Washington, along with several offices tied to his political operations. What investigators uncovered was overwhelming. Agents collected extensive files showing every judicial nomination Cruz had shaped, perfectly matched with financial documents showing the payments he received. They recovered spreadsheets that listed the price of different judicial appointments and tracked payments like entries in a business ledger. They also uncovered messages with wealthy donors and foreign contacts, discussing specific legal cases and which judges they needed placed to secure favorable rulings. The international reach of the scandal grew even more alarming. The Russian connections Crockett mentioned were only the starting point. Evidence showed Cruz had accepted money from Saudi Arabia, China, the United Arab Emirates, and even North Korea through complicated financial routes designed to hide their origin. In return, he helped confirm judges expected to deliver rulings that supported these countries' interests inside the United States. The national security fallout was massive, raising doubts about hundreds of judicial decisions made by judges Cruz helped install. The political shock came instantly. Every judge Cruz had backed during his Senate career faced immediate investigation. 17 federal judges resigned at once rather than endure public scrutiny. Dozens of court cases were ordered to be retried because of concerns that the judges who handled them might have been compromised. The entire federal judicial system suddenly faced a crisis of trust as Americans questioned whether many recent decisions were legitimate at all. The Republican Party struggled to respond. Some of Cruz's closest allies quickly tried to separate themselves, insisting they had no idea what he had been doing. Others claimed it was a politically motivated attack, but they couldn't explain the mountain of proof. The conservative legal world, which had long viewed Cruz as one of its leading intellectual voices, found itself in turmoil. The Federalist Society named in Cruz's communications as helping coordinate some of the judicial deals faced immediate legal scrutiny and the possibility of criminal charges. Financial investigators soon uncovered that Cruz had accumulated more than $200 million through his judicial bribery network, far more than his reported wealth. The money was hidden across offshore accounts, crypto wallets, and investments pushed through shell companies. It took months of forensic accounting to track the full trail. Most of the funds were eventually recovered and directed toward restitution for American taxpayers who had been impacted by corrupt court rulings. When Ted Cruz finally stood trial, the case became one of the most closely followed legal events in modern U.S. history. Prosecutors presented evidence even more damaging than what Crockett revealed during the hearing. They showed that Cruz had started planning the scheme before entering the Senate, viewing political power as a way to profit from judicial appointments. Witnesses ranged from billionaires who described direct payment for appointment deals to foreign agents who spoke about promises Cruz made regarding specific judicial outcomes, to judges who admitted they understood their confirmation depended on delivering certain rulings. Cruz's defense tried to argue that trading influence over judges was simply part of politics, but that collapsed once prosecutors presented financial transfers, recordings, and documents linking payments to case outcomes. The defense then shifted to claiming Cruz was mentally overwhelmed by years of public pressure. However, psychological evaluations confirmed he was fully aware of his actions and understood he was engaged in deliberate criminal conduct. In the end, Cruz's lawyers had nothing left except a plea for mercy, arguing that his years in public office should count in his favor. But that claim fell flat, because his so-called public service had been nothing more than a disguise for a massive corruption empire. The jury needed only 6 hours to reach a unanimous decision, finding him guilty on all 93 charges, including bribery, racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy, and even treason. The treason charge was especially historic because it connected directly to Cruz's work with foreign governments to quietly shape the American judicial system. When the judge issued a life sentence with no chance of parole, He said Cruz's betrayal of the country's legal system was so deep and destructive that no lighter punishment could ever reflect the scale of the harm. The fallout for American democracy was enormous. Congress responded by passing the Judicial Integrity Act, a sweeping reform bill that won overwhelming bipartisan support. The law required all judicial nominees to undergo rigorous financial investigations. It also made it a federal crime for senators to discuss judicial nominations with donors, and it created an independent oversight office dedicated to protecting the integrity of the judiciary. These reforms were the most dramatic changes to the nomination process in modern history. The federal courts also went through a complete reconstruction. Trust in judicial rulings fell sharply at first, but gradually improved as compromised. Judges were removed and replaced transparently. New ethical rules required judges to publicly disclose any contact they had ever had with the senators who supported their confirmation. The era in which hidden funding shaped the courts finally came to an end. Although the judiciary's reputation had been severely damaged in the process, for Jasmine Crockett, her confrontation with Cruz elevated her to national prominence as Congress's strongest and most fearless anti-corruption leader. Her calm, focused questioning, even as Cruz repeatedly tried to derail her, and the way she presented overwhelming evidence with perfect timing became legendary. The moment she delivered her final remark about blood money, while Cruz sat defeated, became one of the most iconic scenes of modern politics. Law schools soon began teaching that exchange as a lesson in preparation, strategy, and discipline. Cruz's arrest triggered a wave of further investigations. While none were as massive as his own scheme, federal agents uncovered similar patterns of misconduct among other senators involved in the judicial selection process. 3 additional senators were arrested, and dozens more faced ethics reviews. The entire system of nominating and confirming federal judges was rebuilt from the ground up, with new transparency rules that would have been unimaginable before the Cruz scandal. What had once been an open secret in Washington, the idea that judicial seats could be traded for money, became a serious felony with long prison sentences. 5 years after the hearing, national studies found that the quality and independence of federal court decisions had greatly improved. Cases were being resolved based on legal merit instead of financial influence. Although the justice system still had flaws, it was no longer being corrupted by the kind of systemic bribery Cruz embodied. The term blood money became a permanent symbol of judicial corruption, forever tied to the way Cruz sold the justice system to wealthy interests. The transformation of the judicial nomination process became complete and irreversible. The hidden deals and dark money influence that had shaped the courts for decades were replaced with open procedures and strict oversight. Senators no longer had the freedom to trade judicial appointments for campaign funds without triggering an immediate investigation. Federal courts implemented tough recusal rules to prevent judges from hearing cases involving anyone connected to the senators who confirmed them. If this exposure of the largest judicial corruption operation in U.S. history has shown anything, it's that the people who interrupt the loudest often have the most to hide, and that democracy depends on representatives who are willing to challenge corruption, even when it reaches the most powerful levels of the government. Make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell, because we'll continue tracking these investigations and revealing how the justice system was nearly sold off until determined voices refused to be silenced by desperate attempts to stop the truth.